Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 8th of September 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let's now begin the discussion. This article appears on page 1 and it is a big achievement for our defense sector capabilities. Hypersonic cruise vehicle test puts India in elite club. Now yesterday, the hypersonic air-breathing scramjet technology was successfully demonstrated by DRDO because it successfully conducted flight test of hypersonic technology demonstrator vehicle, which will lead to the development of hypersonic cruise missiles and vehicles in future. Now, first let us understand why it is important to cover these news. Because in 2014, UPSC had asked, with reference to Agni 4 missile, which of the following statements are correct. So let us now look at the statements. Statement 1 said, it is a surface-to-surface missile. Statement 2 said, it is fueled by liquid propellants only. And statement 3 said, it can deliver 1-ton nuclear warheads about 7,500 kilometers away. Now anyone reading newspaper regularly would know that statement 3 is incorrect. Its range is much smaller. If you reject third statement from all the options, you are left with one only correct, which is the right answer as well. So in this regard, let us understand scramjet and ramjet technologies as they can be asked in prelims examination. Also under the GS3 syllabus, achievements of Indians in space technology, indigenization of technology and development of new technology is a part of syllabus. So what exactly is hypersonic? In aerodynamics, a hypersonic speed is one that greatly exceeds the speed of sound. So the speed of sound is the distance traveled per unit time by a sound wave as it propagates through an elastic medium. So it basically comes out to be 343 meters per second. And generally the hypersonic speeds are considered to be the 5 times speed of sound, which basically comes out to be 1715 meters per second. If you convert this number into kilometers per hour, it comes out to be around 6,000 kilometers per hour, which is a great speed. And yesterday, the technology which India has actually successfully implemented will enable India to develop aircrafts and missiles which can actually fly at speeds equal to or larger than 6,000 kilometers per hour. So let us just understand what that is. And for that, you will need to first understand that how a plane or any object flies. So for any object to fly or move in the air, you need thrust. And the principle behind the thrust is application of Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The planes move forward because the force of the hot exhaust gas shooting backwards from the jet pushes the plane forward. Action and in response, reaction. And for that, you need both fuel as well as oxygen, which is oxidizer, which helps in the burning of the fuel, which creates this exhaust. And this is also the principle of jet engines. And there are two kinds of them. First is turbojet engine and the second one is the focus of this discussion, which will be ramjet and scramjet. So if you want to have oxygen, either you can suck the air in from the atmosphere, which the planes do, and provide the oxygen as a fuel. So the turbojet engines are air-breathing jet engines. They consist of a gas turbine which has an air inlet and a compressor through which the air enters inside the compressor where the actual heating is going on, which provides for the thrust. This is one way to do it. Another way to do that is to move the object at such a high speed that the forward motion is used to compress the air itself and there is no compressor present. Fuel is injected into the combustion chamber where it mixes with hot compressed air and ignites. You can get rid of the compressor as well as the fans or turbine in case of ramjet and scramjet technologies. They are very, very simple. It's just like a tube molded in a peculiar shape, and if the aircraft is already flying at a high speed, and then if this technology is activated, then the forward motion of the plane itself is sufficient to provide both for the oxygen as well as the compression, which creates immense power. And that is where the role of ramjet and scramjet technologies come. Now, the difference between ramjet and scramjet is nothing but the speed. The average speed on which ramjet technology can be used is 3 to 6 Mach, whereas beyond that we need scramjet technology, and we don't need to go into details of it because the only difference is that of a shape of the tube and nothing else. So now you can easily understand that if a plane is on a runway, scramjet or ramjet are not useful. You first need this plane to fly in the air and fly at a speed of 3 Mach at least, and as soon as this 3 Mach speed is achieved, the scramjet engine which is attached with the aircraft is activated, which then for the rest of the journey takes care of the speed, and as soon as it reaches the 6 Mach, the scramjet engine can also be activated. So of course there is going to be either ramjet or scramjet on a single aircraft because it cannot accommodate so many engines, because you already need first engine to get them airborne. So what are the advantages which these ramjet and scramjet technologies provide? First is, of course, they can achieve the speed similar to those of rockets without carrying any oxidizer. You have seen the rockets, and most of the weight of the rocket is because of the fuel and oxidizer, and hence it makes it lighter. Of course, since there is no engine in the form of turbine is involved, there are no moving parts, and hence they are very, very safe and their maintenance is very low. The advantage because of which we are trying to adopt ramjet and scramjet technologies in our defense system is because they fly at such a high speed that it becomes very difficult to intercept them because they fly so fast. And of course, the disadvantage is because of their design, and no flying object can fly only on ramjet or scramjet. You have to get an object flying first at the speed of at least 2 to 3 Mach, and then ramjet and scramjet technology can be activated. And so you always need some other engine to get these aircrafts airborne, and from there ramjet will take care. So this ramjet and scramjet will become very important from the perspective of prelims as well as mains examination. Keep in mind the hypersonic speeds, thrust, the mechanism as well as advantages and disadvantages. The article Empower the Youth First appears on page number 7. This article in totality lays emphasis on the investment on the youth population, and hence in this regard we will first understand who the youth is in our country according to our government and what we do for them. Then we will go on and explore the financial outlays for the overall youth population, and then why we will see it is insufficient. We will also understand the current status of our youth with respect to their economic, health as well as skill levels, and then we will discuss the idea which has been proposed in this particular article, which is inspired from or which is modeled along European Union's Youth Guarantee Program. It is important to comprehend these articles because they provide fodder for the mains examination, as it directly correlates with the syllabus of GS2 as well as essay. Apart from that, in this discussion we will go through a lot of reports which can be directly asked in prelims examination as well. So let us first understand who the youth is. So according to National Youth Policy 2014, so it is important to remember that the current youth policy was launched in 2014, and it defined youth as all the people belonging to the age group of 15 to 29. So a person having an age of 14 is not a youth, and similarly a person of the age of 30 is not a youth. 15 to 29 is a youth. Then if we talk about our commitment to the youth or what we do for them, of course we have a committed and a dedicated ministry. Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports under which we have Department of Youth Affairs, which runs various kinds of schemes for the betterment of youth. But if you have a look at overall schemes and policies of Government of India, the component of youth can be found in education, because if we talk about schools and colleges and university, there is a component for youth. Then skill development is obviously focused towards the youth. Employment guarantee schemes like Manrega and various other startup schemes, although is meant to help everyone, but a component of it obviously goes to people belonging to the age of 15 to 29. And similarly, what we do in healthcare as well as the food subsidies we provide obviously gives benefits to the people belonging to this section. And if we take into account the overall expenditure incurred by central government on youth population in single financial year, it comes out to be around 90,000 crore. So that is the amount which we spend on youth overall. And authors say that let's assume that every rupee spent by central government is matched by the state governments. And so the total financial outlay on youth becomes 1.8 lakh crores. If we compare it with total GDP of our economy, then it comes out to be less than 1% of the GDP. And from here on, authors build their case as to why it is not sufficient. And that is because, according to the report of World Bank, investing in young children and youth, the loss of not investing in children and youth can be estimated to be around 4% of the GDP every year. So according to a World Bank report, all those countries which are not investing sufficiently in youth and children, there is around 4% loss to their GDP every year because of the lack of investment. And of this, around 0.6% of the loss to the GDP will come only because the youth which the country is churning out are simply unemployable, because you have not invested enough to develop their skills. And that brings us to a question as to what is the current status of our youth. So if we just start with the participation of youth in our economy, the youth participation in India's labor force is around 38.3%. Now you should understand these terms. For example, what is employment rate or what is unemployment rate? What is the meaning of participation in labor force? How this is calculated? Let us know in the comment section what does it mean by participation in labor force. Then if we talk about unemployment rate, India's current youth unemployment rate is estimated to be at least 18.3%. Now this number might not look very large, but if you take into overall youth population, it comes out to be around 3.5 crore youth. So 3.5 crore youth in India currently are unemployed. This data was given in a 2018 report, State of Working India report, according to which about 30% of the youth fall under neither in employment nor in education category. And that is a big problem, because if you are unemployed but pursuing education, that is good. But if you are neither employed nor you are pursuing any education, that is a big problem. So this is as far as economy is concerned. Let's talk about their health status. Now, according to Global Nutrition Report, India is home to around 46.6 million stunted children, which is around third of world's total stunted population of children. Now, here we are obviously not talking about youth, but these children are going to become youth because in 2018 they were 5 years or younger, and within 10 years they will become the youth. And if a person faces stunting and wasting in childhood, it is very, very difficult to reverse the trend of malnutrition. So this is about health status. Then let us have a look at the skill level of our youth. And one of the biggest challenges which India faces is huge proportion of poorly trained workers in our country. The large majority of skill training is carried out through self-taught practices, observation, or transfer of skills from a master craftsman to an apprentice. And hence, there is a severe shortage of formally skilled workforce. Now, what is the difference between an informal skill and a formal skill? So a person possessing formal skill has a certificate approved by the government. and hence that certificate can be utilized for getting jobs, whereas a person can be highly skilled but does not have certificate, and hence it becomes very difficult for him or her to get job in the formal sector. And of course, the salaries and the job safety is much higher in the formal sector. So if we talk about numbers, the proportion of formally skilled workers in India is dismally low at 4.6% of total workforce. Now you will ask, why is it low? It is low because the same percentage is 24% in China, 52% in US. And if we talk about Germany, it is 80%, and in Japan, it is around 96%, and same is with South Korea. So now you can understand that out of each 100 youth person in Japan, 96 of them have formally been trained, whereas in India, only 5% of overall youth population possesses some kind of formal skill, and hence it becomes very difficult for an Indian youth to find job in formal sector, and hence most of them are employed in informal sector. And that is where today's editorial comes into play, where it says that this is an appropriate time to launch an Indian Youth Guarantee Program, quite similar to or modeled along the lines of European Union's Youth Guarantee Program, which was started in 2010 at a time when the youth unemployment rates were soaring above 20%. So when in Europe the unemployment rates rose, they came up with Youth Guarantee Program, and let us look at some of the highlighting features of this program. And this is where the role of such articles come into play. Whenever you have to write an essay or an answer in mains examination, the potential of your answer to get higher marks increases if you quote some past studies or initiatives taken by other states or even countries as a way forward. It shows that you are not only concerned with the problems of the society, but you also are interested in looking for solutions. So under this program, all the countries committed to 3 points that they are going to implement a national program which will mandatorily include these 3 points. What are those 3 points? First, they are going to run programs for education and training which shall be oriented towards employment, and not just for the purpose of education. Those programs will target some or the other employment. Then, all the nations committed themselves for running a program which shall commit itself for employment intermediation services. What are these? Now you understand that biggest obstruction to the job is lack of information. People often do not know what skills do they have or what skills they should acquire in order to make use of their talents. And even if they have acquired right kind of skills, often they do not have idea as to where to look for the right kind of job as far as their skills are concerned. And hence European Union governments committed themselves to initiate intermediation services by the government themselves. And finally, they agreed for active labor market policies. For example, they committed themselves to implement such policies which will tilt the behavior of the industries towards hiring more people. Now, one of the examples would be providing hiring subsidies to the companies. If they decide to hire more people, government is going to bear some cost of the salary. So the authors suggest some scheme along this line. But of course, everything boils down to the problem of expenses. If currently we are not able to spend even 1.8 lakh crore if we include all the states and central government, and given the COVID pandemic and the kind of toll it has taken on the overall revenues of the governments, how is it going to be possible for the government to float such a scheme? And for that, authors have suggested a way out. And that is creation of youth component plan. And according to the authors, it should be modeled on a line similar to the tribal sub-plan. So as far as expenses are concerned, they say that the government should mandate each and every department and ministry to allocate a fixed percentage of their budget towards the youth. So for example, if Ministry of Heavy Industries has allocated certain budget, let's say of 1000 crore, and if youth component plan is 10%, then they have to show that 100 crore has mandatorily gone towards the creation of skills in heavy industries for the youth population. And then the second important thing which the program should contain is that it should provide guarantee of employment within a fixed time frame after the completion of the education or after a job loss. And that job which shall be provided will be according to the formal skill which the youth will bring with her. Now the question arises that what about those people who do not have any skills, and for them the program should also contain the option of skilling in case they don't have one, and reskilling in case of those whose skills have become outdated and the jobs according to those skills do not exist in the market anymore. And the skilling and reskilling provisions should be on demand. A person can walk into the center or register herself on a portal and get the job. So this is it as far as this editorial is concerned. It is very, very important for you from the perspective of prelims examination to understand the requirement for being a youth, that there exists a ministry dedicated towards youth affairs. It is also important for us to memorize these data from the perspective of mains examination. And of course, as a way forward, this Indian Youth Guarantee Program can be recommended in mains answers. So this article, The Search for an End to the Complex Naga Conflict, appears as a lead article on page number 6. It goes into the historical context and the present situation of the Naga problem. So in this regard, we have already discussed every relevant thing from the perspective of UPSC examination in our DNS. And hence, we will revise it in a very, very succinct manner. But before that, these are the two statements which you have to recall if they are correct or not. Nagaland has been given special status under our constitution is the first statement, and annexation of Nagaland took place in 1881 is the second statement. Now you have to find out whether they are true or false based on the discussion which we are going to have. So in DNS dated 30th of June 2020, we started the discussion of Naga issue by first understanding who are the Naga people and where they are situated. So first you have to understand that Naga is not a single tribe. Rather it is a collection of a lot of tribes together known as Naga people. They are not only found in Nagaland, but they live in other states, for example in Manipur, Assam and Arunachal Pradesh as well as a significant population of Nagaland is also distributed in Myanmar. That is across the international border. So Naga as an identity is not concentrated only in India. Then in the same discussion we discussed about Article 371A. Under Article 371A, special status has been given to Nagaland, where any central law enacted by the Parliament in certain areas has to be approved by the Legislative Assembly of Nagaland. And some special powers have also been given to governor in matters of law and order. Then in the same discussion, we also discussed the integration of Nagaland into our country, which started with the process of annexation of Northeast in 1826. And the Naga Hills, or the part of the Himalayas in that region, is known as Naga Hills, which was annexed by Britishers in 1881. Then we also discussed the assertion of identity by the Naga people for the first time in the form of Naga Club in 1918. In the Simon Commission, the Nagas were represented separately, and in front of the commission, they expressed their views to be left alone. Then the time of independence came, and let's see what happened on the eve of independence, that is just before the independence. So just before the independence, an organization by the name of Naga National Council had come into existence. It was headed by a very prominent Naga person, Mr. A.Z. Fizo. So as the time of our independence closed in, Naga National Council declared independence. So the organization led by Mr. Angamizapu Fizo declared independence from India, and his resolve was to establish an independent and sovereign Naga land. But of course, we can easily understand that Government of India did not agree to such a unilateral declaration of independence by Naga people and especially Naga National Council. After that, under the leadership of AZ Fizo, a Naga federal government was established along with Naga Federal Army, which started a war of insurgency, which is the war which is continuing till today. Of course, most of the Naga insurgency groups have surrendered and have entered into peace treaty with our country, but nonetheless, the problem still goes on. So let's see what happened after India gained independence. We know that Naga National Council had already come into existence along with government and army. And these rebel groups carried out their movement against our country and army. And this insurgency continued. And just like any other insurgent movement, a lot of factions cropped up in subsequent time. So as you can see, by the time 1988 came, there were two main factions of overall Naga insurgency. One was NSCN-K and another one was NSCN-IM. So the alphabets K and IM represent the name of the leader. So one faction headed by Mr. Khaplang became NSCM-K, and then another group headed by Mr. Sak and Mr. Muiva became NSCN-IM. This is also the group which later on signed the ceasefire agreement with the government of India. The two of the main demands of NSCN-IM were that the unique history of Naga people should be recognized and they should not be submerged under overall Indian identity. And then second, which is the most crucial demand, is that they wanted the creation of greater Naga territorial unification. What does that? So in the beginning of this discussion, we understood that Naga people are not concentrated just in Nagaland, and there are 3 other states which have the population of Naga people. And one of the contentions of NSCN-IM was that they were ready to give up the complete independence and sovereignty demand if all the areas in which the Naga people live is combined and made a single state of Greater Nagalim. It's Greater Nagalim because it consists of all the Naga people and their territories. Then finally in 1997, a ceasefire agreement was signed between the Government of India and NSCN-IM, in which immunity were given to the armed cadres, which basically means that no criminal prosecution shall be conducted against the people who took up arms against Indian state. And of course, both the sides decided to stop the offensive against each other. And also there was agreement on cessation of forcible tax collection. So the insurgent groups agreed not to force local people to pay taxes. But of course, by this agreement, the government of India recognized their power to collect taxes nonetheless. And this is a big problem because no other authority except for the state of India has the power to levy and collect taxes, but it was shared with the Naga insurgent groups in 1997. And what was agreed was that they can't force the local people, but of course they can collect the tax. And hence, this as a consequence led to a big problem because the credibility of the local politicians who were involved with the democratic process of our Indian and state government lost their credibility. And of course, Indian state lost control in a significant way. So the system of parallel governance and parallel political process was kind of legitimized in 1997, and that has created problems. And then finally in 2015, all the stakeholders in this problem entered into framework agreement. But the problem with the framework agreement is that no one knows what was actually signed. There is no detail which is available in public domain. But Mr. R.N. Ravi, who is also currently the governor of Nagaland, has informed Parliamentary Standing Committee as to what were the main points of the framework agreement. And he stated 3 things. First is that the government of India has agreed to recognize the uniqueness of Naga history. The government of India has made it clear that there is not going to be any reorganization of the states. And hence, the demand of the NSCN-IM, according to Mr. R.N. Ravi, has not been agreed upon. So he stated that Government of India did not agree and made it clear that the territories of other states where the Naga people reside currently shall not be annexed into Nagaland. Then what did the Government of India agree upon? And the Government of India agreed that special arrangements would be made for Nagas. Wherever there is a significant population of Naga people, they could be given increased independence or autonomy in matters of their own affairs, something like provisions of 6th schedule. So this is what Mr. R.N. Ravi has informed the Parliamentary Standing Committee. So now why the problem of Naga insurgency and the Naga issue has come into limelight? And that is mainly because of the revocation of special status of Jammu and Kashmir by diluting the provisions of Article 370. Because of which, NSC and IM is worried that the special status of Nagaland could also be diluted in near future. At the same time, we should also understand the causes behind the prevailing peace in Nagaland in last 2 to 3 decades. You do not hear violence-related activities from Nagaland, right? First is that there is an overall decline in the violence in Nagaland. Because not only the ceasefire has been signed, but it has been extended indefinitely by both the sides. And the process of peace talks has continued. Because it has received the continued support of almost all the Prime Minister in last 2 decades. And the second is the change in the perception of the Naga people. They have started to understand the challenges of independence. There is a sense of realization that overall independence from Indian Union is after all not such a good idea. And also because Naga people have slowly but steadily started to distance themselves from the insurgent groups. Because of the forcible tax collections and intimidation, they are not feeling well or positive about the insurgent groups. Also, the insurgent groups themselves have declined in popularity and their effectivity because either the top leaders are old or they have passed away, and the leaders which have replaced the older leaders like Isaac Muiva and Khaplang are not as influential as their predecessors. And finally, these insurgent groups used to get the safe harbor in Myanmar and Bangladesh. Now we have established such good relations with Bangladesh and Myanmar in last 10 to 15 years that the safe harbors being provided to these insurgent groups in both these countries have now been finished. So this is it as far as overall Naga situation is concerned. The article which you will read today as a lead article explains all of this. The screenshots of these slides shall be provided in the description of the video. Then this next news appears on page number 9. Tibetan soldiers' funeral seen as Delhi's signal to Beijing. Now why is this funeral of a Tibetan soldier such a big deal? Because he was a member of Special Frontier Force, which was created in 1962 after the Indo-Chinese War. So in the initial stages, its main goal was to conduct covert operations behind Chinese lines in the event of another Sino-Indian war. For a period of 2 to 3 years, Indian government did not acknowledge its existence. But for the first time, the public acknowledgement of its existence came after a personnel who participated in an operation with CIA in 1965 to place a nuclear powered device on Mount Nanda Devi to monitor Chinese nuclear weapon tests. So it is based in Chakrata in Uttarakhand. As far as the administrative directions and controls are concerned, it was put under direct supervision of Intelligence Bureau, and later on it was transferred to Research and Analysis Wing or RAW. And you should remember that it is not part of Indian Army, but of course functions under the operational control with its own rank structure, charter and training infrastructure. Now you might ask that why such a special provision has been created for SFF. And that is because it involves the matter of Tibetan refugees, which is a very sensitive matter for China. But overall, it falls under the authority of Director General on Security in Cabinet Secretariat, which is headed by Inspector General, who is selected from Major General rank of Indian Army and directly reporting to Prime Minister. Now if we talk about their contribution, they have participated in 1970 war between India and Pakistan for the liberation of Bangladesh, and they were deployed in the Chittagong Hill tracts during that war. And since the Special Frontier Force involved people from Tibetan Autonomous Region, the government of India has always shied away from recognizing first their existence, then their participation, But this is the first time that the government of India is officially carrying out a funeral for them, and which is a big shift in India's foreign policy itself. Then this next news item appears on page number 8. Who will lead the Jambu Savari? Art and culture has always been an enigma for UPSC aspirants, and no one knows from where UPSC asks questions. And hence, in this regard, it is important for us to take a closer look at Jambu Savari of Mysore Dasara, which is of course a 10-day festival culminating on the day of Vijayadashmi. But in case of Mysore, things are different because Mysore Dasara is a royal festival celebrating victory of truth over evil, and it has been given direct patronage by the royal family since centuries. Also, in Karnataka, Dasara is observed as a state festival known by the name of Nadahabba, and it is of course steered by the royal family of Mysore, which performs special worship on the occasion of Dasara and shower flowers on presiding deity, who is Chamundeshwari Devi, placed in golden howdah carried by elephant Arjuna. On the day of Vijayadashmi, the traditional Dasara procession, locally known by the name of Jambu Savari, is held on the street of Mysore city. The main attraction of this procession is the idol of goddess Chamundeshwari, which is placed on golden mandap on top of a decorated elephant. The cultural programs by famous artists are arranged in the palace along with sports, wrestling, poets meet, food festival, film festival and it is also witnessed by large number of people on the occasion of Dasara. Now the question arises that why this news has appeared. This news has appeared because Abhimanyu, or a 55-year-old elephant, who is slated to be the Arjuna this time, or the elephant who will carry the howdah this time, will get the approval of the Dasara High Power Committee or not. And the way this news has appeared on the national page makes it important for us to remember these points from the perspective of prelims examination. So an article appears on page number 1. Government intervention in education policy should be minimal, says Prime Minister. Since the new Education Policy 2020 has already been launched, and hence it becomes very important for us to keep in mind various important provisions of this policy, which has already been discussed in our DNS dated 30th of July 2020, which was the day after this policy was launched. So let us just quickly revise first the important constitutional provisions dealing with the education in our country. So the provisions for education of women has been provided for in Article 15. Article 21A talks about right to education. Then the provisions related to religious education in our country has been provided in Article 25 and Article 28. The issue of minority education has been dealt in Article 29. Under Directive Principles of State Policy, two articles, 45 and 46, talk about education. Article 45 talks about right of free and compulsory education, whereas Article 46 talks about promotion of education and economic interests of SC, STs and other weaker sections. Article 51A also talks about education. So under Article 51A, subsection H talks about development of scientific temper, humanism and the spirit of inquiry and reform. And K talks about the duties of the parents and guardians to provide opportunities for education of children between the age of 6 and 14 years. Then Article 350A talks about instruction in mother tongue at primary stage. Then if we talk about education as a subject matter to be shared between the center and the states, it finds its place in all the three lists. But mainly, education as a subject is a concurrent subject. Both center and states have the powers to deal with the education. Item number 25, 26 and 27 talk about education in the concurrent list. So let us now quickly revise the important provisions of National Education Policy 2020. Starting with the school education. National Education Policy aims for universalization of education. And universalization of school education not just from school level but from preschool level to the secondary level. It targets to achieve 100% gross enrollment ratio by 2030, that is 10 years from now. Now it has also changed the school curricular structure. Currently we know that it is mainly based on 10 plus 2 structure. It has been now resolved that it will be changed from 10 plus 2 to 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4. So instead of two components, we are going to have four different components of the school education. Now the new curriculum is going to lay special emphasis on literacy and numeracy skills of the students. And also it will focus on vocational education, which is going to be started right at the beginning of the class 6th. Then it has decided to come up with National Curriculum Framework for Teachers Education by 2021. And one of the important provisions is that the teaching up to at least grade 5 will be preferentially be conducted in the mother tongue of the student. Then let us now move on to the provisions for higher education. It aims for achieving gross enrollment ratio of 50% by 2035. Then it aims for multiple entry and exit points to be created in higher education. Let us know in the comment section what you understand by multiple entry and exit points in higher education. Then it also aims for creation of academic bank of credits. You complete a course at University A, complete your 2 years, and then you move to University B. Now what happens right now is the credits that you have earned at University A are not usually transferred, but that shall be enabled in times to come. Then it also envisages a National Research Foundation. And one of the biggest reforms which have been made the part of the new education policy is Higher Education Commission of India, which is going to replace University Grants Commission. It will have 4 different verticals. So this reform has been announced as far as the regulation of higher education in India is concerned. Now these 4 different verticals, starting with NHERC or National Higher Education Regulatory Council, will do the work of regulation, whereas GEC or General Education Council will do the standard setting, whereas HEGC or Higher Education Grants Council will take care of the funding needs of these institutions, and finally for accreditation it has created NAC or National Accreditation Council. And as far as the regulation of higher education institutions are concerned, the public and private colleges and institutions are going to be treated the same way. So there is not going to be any differentiation. Then there are other measures also which have been announced as a part of national education policy. The first is the creation of National Educational Technology Forum, which will be a platform for exchange of ideas as far as education is concerned. Then the government has also announced a Gender Inclusion Fund, which will be utilized to incentivize women education in our country. Then special education zones have also been announced for the disadvantaged groups as well as for disadvantaged regions. So that is to make the education system inclusive. And one of the most prominent announcement under NAP is that it paves the way for the entry of foreign universities in our country. But the condition has also been imposed. Only those universities which are ranked under top 100 across the world can enter into our country, open their campuses and run courses. So these are the important provisions of National Education Policy 2020. Now try to find out if you were able to solve the statements given at the beginning of the discussion correctly. So the first news which we discussed was related to the hypersonic technology. Now the statement says only USA, Russia and Israel have hypersonic technology. This statement is incorrect because India has become the 4th country after USA, Russia and China to possess hypersonic technology. Now in the discussion on youth, we discussed 2 important reports, State of Working India, and if you have seen the discussion carefully, the screenshot itself showed that it is not released by Niti Aayog, rather it is released by Azim Premji Foundation. Similarly, we also talked about Global Nutrition Report, which the statement says is released by UNICEF, which is also incorrect. Try to find out who releases Global Nutrition Report. Then the next statement says labor force participation rate is measure of an economy's active workforce, which is correct because the labor force participation rate is obtained by dividing the number of people actively participating in labor force by total number of people eligible to participate in the labor force, and hence it gives you quite a precise idea about how much of the workforce is active workforce. We discussed about National Education Policy 2020. And here are the two statements. It aims for universalization of higher education by 2035. Now this is incorrect because it does not aims for universalization of higher education to begin with. And then it has enabled the entry of all foreign universities in our country, which is also incorrect because it has applied a filter or a criteria for opening up branches in our country, which is that first, that university has to be among top 100 across the world.